Fala, Rafael, tudo bem?
Oba, tudo bom? Senini que tá falando, é isso?
Isso mesmo.
Tudo jóia? Você me dá um segundo aqui para eu lavar um negócio.
Não, tranquilo. Você me chama.
Oi, Jaque, tudo bem?
Rafa, tudo bom?
Tudo jóia, e você?
Tudo jóia.
Ô, Senini, já tá com o botãozinho de tradução, tudo certo, no Zoom?
Ele ia fazer até, mas que bom que você já entrou, porque você aí faz aquela conversa que eu tive contigo, de dizer para ele que vai ter tradução simultânea remota, que tem uma tradutora, entendeu? Porque às vezes eles falam muito rápido e esquecem que tem alguém
Ah, eu
traduzindo.
avisei, eu avisei o pessoal.
Ah, então massa. Pronto, então podem me colocar na cabine.
Vou iniciar então, tá bom?
Massa. Pode fazer.
Aí, já que se quiser também tirar a imagem, que na hora que o pessoal
Ah,
entrar,
certamente.
já consigo. Obrigado.
E aí vocês vão explicar direitinho como é que usa o botão, essas coisas, né?
Aí, Rafael, ensinar o botão, tá?
Ah, tá bom. Eu entrei na sala do inglês aqui e não ouvi. Então eu vou ter que falar para ele apertar o botão, para o Baskin apertar o botão e entrar na sala em inglês, é isso?
Isso, ele tem que entrar no inglês,
Tá,
que é o que a Jaque está habilitado.
tá joia.
Põe em português ali. Rafael, tira uma dúvida.
Diga lá.
A Suzana vai sair ou ela pode continuar até o final?
Ela vai sair. Quer
Ela
dizer,
fala e sai.
assim que ela entrar, a gente confirma isso, mas eu acho que ela não vai poder ficar. Pode ser?
Sim. É que, só para a gente não... A configuração aqui, só para a gente já saber como configurar.
Tá bom.
O Cadu tá entrando aí. Fala,
Nossa,
Cadu!
e aí, aê! Tudo bem? Bom dia.
Bom dia.
Nossa, tava dando problema aqui, alguma coisa aqui. Bom dia, Rafael.
Beleza,
Tudo
Cadu?
bem? Bom dia,
Joia.
Jaque. Eu tava ouvindo, eu tava entrando como, sei lá, participante, tava estranho
É
esse
que o
webinar.
Rafael criou como webinar.
Ah, tá. O webinar é
Não como
diferente,
reunião.
né?
O webinar quem vai entrando vai assistindo os palestrantes.
Ah,
A diferença da reunião pro webinar é essa.
e tem o Q&A, né? São as perguntas e respostas.
Ele habilitou também, mas isso aí também tranquilo.
A gente não vai usar, né? Porque o Q&A é só para quem assiste pelo Zoom.
A
Boa.
Jaque mandou um abração aí para você, viu, Cadu?
Tá, então, eu vi aqui.
É que ela já tá na sala, já configurou já o...
Ah, tá, vou entrar lá na interpretação. Hi. Português.
Você tem que
Tá,
entrar no inglês.
tá tudo certo, Sanini?
Sim,
Com o YouTube nosso, Facebook deles?
já tá tudo configurado já.
Fechou.
Eu vi que vocês tinham criado no YouTube, quer dizer, no Facebook, essa palestra. Mas
Nossa, aqui.
eu acho que ele entra direto.
Entra direto, né?
Eu acho que entra.
No Facebook da Flip?
O Facebook
Isso.
da Flip, eles tinham criado o evento.
Meu filho tirou todas as senhas do meu computador, meu. Ai, é um saco isso. Agora eu vou ter que... Cada login...
Ele limpou os cookies, tá fazendo coisa
Limpou
errada, hein?
tudo.
Ele tá fazendo coisa errada aí.
Então, tô achando estranho isso.
Limpar o cookie aí é fazer coisa errada.
Não, mas ele tem 8 anos, acho que foi mó cabacice mesmo. Palestra 011. Tem que lembrar as senhas de tudo. Opa, lembrei. E tá tudo certo com os convidados, Rafael?
Tudo certo. Eu falei com eles, fiz uma reunião com eles sexta-feira. A princípio não
Ah,
teremos.
legal.
Nunca se sabe, né?
Pô, a do Emicida ia estourar, hein?
Mas é muito difícil, né? A agenda dos caras é...
Eu conheço o pessoal lá, Fiote, a produtora também. Mas é isso, né? Não é mole, não.
Rafael, o que o Luiz é?
Que Luiz?
Luiz Eduardo Soares. O que ele é?
Ele é uma das principais figuras que trabalha com segurança pública aqui no Brasil, né? Então ele estuda o Comando Vermelho, crime organizado, prisões. Ele foi secretário de Segurança Pública também, se eu não me engano, ou trabalhou como consultor da Secretaria de Segurança Pública para fazer mediação de conflito aí. Então é um cara muito...
O título dele qual é, então?
O título do quê?
Do GC dele. Qual que é vamos dizer, o título dele que a gente pode colocar aqui no GC?
Deixa eu ver aqui, peraí. Deixa eu coreano. Ele foi secretário nacional de Segurança Pública, mas eu não sei se entendi. Onde você quer colocar?
É como se fosse o título, o nome dele. Porque o que eles fazem? O que o CNE faz? Como se fosse Rafael, e aí embaixo, um exemplo, gestor do IB, entendeu? Qual que é como se fosse a nomenclatura que coloca para ele?
É que a mini bio dele é tão grande, talvez valha a pena perguntar.
Ou só o nome.
Ministério do Turismo e Associação Casa Azul.
Casa Azul and Ministry of Tourism is having the 18th International Literary Festivity of Paraty. This is the federal law of incentive cultures, value morals, cultures, and you have the Itaú as the sponsor. Support of the municipality of Paraty and WAL. Association of Casa Azul is the Special Secretariat of Culture, and Pátria Amada Brasil, the government of Brazil, are the accomplishers. You want to understand? That is not that simple to bet on the dialogue resolutions. They are absolutely fragile, and you have to exercise and put the shoes of the others and put ourselves in the other shoes. You have to trust the democratic values democracy is all about, to defend the solutions of the two states for the Palestine and the Israeli conflict. Both people need to get along, to embrace each other, and to know the value of the human life. And because you are Brazilians, because you are Zionists, we are IBI. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Susana Saloma, a collaborator of Brazil-Israel Institute on the name of IBI. Thank you for being in this table that you have. On the other side, there are people, and you have the similarities, Brazil and Israel, in this field of conflict and frontiers. I am Ebra, editor, coordinator of ION, that is literature and culture in Jewish life, and we have in Amazon, Israel and Palestine, an activist searching for peace that is present today, is written by Gershon Baskin. In order to have these access to specific localities, the cultural barriers that can be imposed, or simply not very interesting for the other side, that is quite complicated. And in other common points in these Israel and Palestinian conflicts, we need to have the mediation of conflict, and the theme of the discussion of the table today go in this direction, and will be conducted by Michelle German, that is professor of sociology and coordinator of the interdisciplinary of the Jewish studies of the University of Rio de Janeiro, research and Bulgarian, and academic director of Brazil Israel. The guests are Gershon Barsk, founder and the leader of the organization Israel and Palestine Creative and Regional Initiatives. He is political and social entrepreneurial, focused on renewable energy projects in the Middle East. He has PhD in international affairs from the University of Greenwich. Known by the nickname The Mediator, he was responsible for mediating of the release of the Israelis Gilad Shalit after 5 years and 4 months at the hands of Hamas. Luiz Eduardo Soares is a writer, playwright, anthropologist, political scientist with postdoctorate in political philosophy. He's a visiting professor of UFRJ, retired professor of UERJ, and former professor of URP and UNICAP. He was a visiting scholar at Harvard, Columbia, and Virginia and Pittsburgh universities. He published 20 books. The most recent on which demilitarize the public security and human rights. Brazil is double, and he works in the public security coordinator of security, justice and citizenship of the state of Rio de Janeiro, as well as municipal secretariat of violence prevention in Porto Alegre, Nova Iguaçu. Have a wonderful table of discussion today.
Olá a todos e a todas.
Hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I am Michelle German. I will mediate these conversations between Luiz Eduardo Soares and Gershon Barskin. And you just listened. Who are they? I would like to say that our attempt of IBI is to produce reflections about themes that make sense in Israel and in Brazil. So you can bridge bridges in these dialogues that impact who is thinking about Israel and Brazil. For us, it's clear that are possible connections. It's clear that more and more Brazil is present in Brazil in a sense. Brazil is present in Israel, so it's very important to have these connections with authors, intellectual people that are thinkers in their places. And Luiz Eduardo Soares, in my point of view, and basking together, so you can see that they come from the same field. They think from the same places of voice. Basque and Luiz Edmundo Soares, they were from the same places, from the same party, would have the same subjects in common, would have very vibrant dialogues in politics and cultural aspects. In this sense, we are going to carry on these conversations. It's great to have conversations with both of them. So they are here. One is in Israel, another is in Brazil. Basque is known as the mediator. This is his name that he's treated. And Luiz Eduardo Soares tried to be a mediator of the outskirts to the center, asphalts and slums, the politics and the university. Basking is more connected to the other side, where you have the origin of the title of this table. He makes the connection with the other side of the frontier, the Palestine side, the other ways of having voice, and they work with the translation. Luiz Eduardo Soares has the social, cultural, and political translation of what's going on. And there is another language at the other side of the street, and Baskin effectively is a person that works with another language. In fact, Arabic is one of the vital expressions of Baskin. Baskin is an author in Hebrew, English, and Arabic. He has a column in a Palestine newspaper, and he is an Israeli intellectual, Israeli politician, a mediator, how he is received in the other side. So Baskin, you have all of these. You live in Jerusalem, that is quite complicated. I think the most one, complicated city. I think the second one, the first one is Rio de Janeiro, but you have a lot of complexities. And you are in a complex neighborhood in Jerusalem. It was labor work, and now it's a low income neighborhood, and it's getting more religious, more ethnical. So, in a sense, you had to really cross the street to make the mediation come true. You had to cross the border. You had to go to West Bank, Gaza, but you as an Israeli, as a society member, you are in a paralyzed society, full of political hatred, so stretched in terms of political affairs. Do you think that you have to go to the other side of the border to mediate? So you have to mediate with your neighbor, a person that is down the street. So now you are a mediator in a society that is not only the mediations with the Palestine, but mediation with your Israeli neighbor, Jewish, that is together with you in the same society, but does not understand you, like the Palestine person that is with you and cannot understand. One speaks Hebrew, the other Arabic.
Right. I think, first of all, good morning to everyone. I think that it is very difficult at this point in history to be in the middle between the Israelis and the Palestinians and trying to mediate understanding to bridge the gaps between the parties. We have a failed peace process that's been going on for the past 2 decades. And the problem with the failed peace process is that at the beginning, there was a great deal of hope. There was belief in peace that rose amongst both people. And when both parties signed agreement, there was hope that we would, in a short period of time, reach the promised land, so to speak, reach peace. but that didn't happen. Both sides breached the commitments they undertook in the agreements. They blamed the other side for the failure of the agreements. We had an increase in violence and terrorism rather than a decrease in violence. And today there are fewer people who believe in the chances of peace than ever before. And the tragic reality is that if you ask Israelis, and if you ask Palestinians if they support peace, they will say, yes, I support peace, but they don't. And we have this reality on both sides where both Israelis and Palestinians claim that they want peace, but don't believe that they have a partner on the other side.
Ok. Mas ao mesmo tempo,
But at the same time, Baskin, don't you think that the idea is the other side, is the overcome solution idea that the conflict between Israel and Palestine, that is a national territorial conflict, is by this export and by the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. It is a civilizatory conflict. What I mean by that, you agree more with someone, the Ramallah, that talks about peace, or a person from Jerusalem, your neighbor, that perceives that the other one cannot be connected at all. As they say, there is no partner on the other side to discuss peace. So don't you think that you are not talking about an overcome conflict in terms of a political and territorial aspect? You are having the ideological political conflict to convince you as a mediator in Israel is more important than to conflict the Palestine person, for example?
I think that both publics need to be convinced that there's a partner on the other side. And this is the real challenge, because the failure of the peace process meant that more and more people on both sides lost confidence in the ability to arrive at peace. Both Palestinians and both Israelis in their daily reality live the situation that they see that the other side doesn't want peace. Palestinians see increasing Israeli settlement building and confiscation of land and violation of Palestinian human rights. And Israelis see Palestinians who celebrate when rockets are shot at Israel or when there's a terrorist attack. Israelis think the Palestinians want to drive the Jews into the sea. And this is the reality that both sides see. We don't have leaders, not on the Israeli side and not on the Palestinian side, who are speaking peace to their people. They speak animosity, they speak conflict. And this is what both sides perceive in their daily reality. So it's very difficult on both sides to speak about peace when they don't believe that the other side is a partner for peace.
Você conversa com Hamas, não é?
You talk to Hamas, right?
Yes, I do.
And for many Israelis, would be the devil embodied, incorporated. So you cannot talk to fundamentalists, Islam fundamentalists. So there is this kind of very right, extreme right in Israel and the Hamas in Palestine. So this is the dialogue that you have, the bombs, the terrorism attack. This is the dialogue in place for years. So you and Israeli, so there is an effort in your speech as an Israeli voice. So you as an Israeli, how can you explain to another Israeli that it's possible to talk to Hamas, to dialogue? Is it possible to dialogue with religious fundamentalists from the other side?
I think it's very difficult, but I think it's also important to realize that Hamas, that was created back in 1988, 1989, is a completely different organization than Hamas of 2021. There have been developments. I'm not saying that Hamas is moderate. It is not moderate. It's an extremist organization. But the difference of Hamas today from Hamas of the past is in the pragmatism that Hamas is demonstrating on the ground. And I think this is evident that the current government of Israel, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, has been negotiating with Hamas for years, through the Egyptians, through the Qataris, through the Turks, and through others, in order to maintain some kind of modus vivendi that both sides can live. Israel has never really tried to replace Hamas or get rid of Hamas. This is not realistic thinking. But I think it's also important to look at the pragmatism demonstrated by Hamas. Even now, when just 2 days ago, President Abbas in Ramallah issued a decree declaring that new elections will take place. And this was a result of the agreement of Hamas with Abbas, between Fatah and Hamas, to engage in a new democratic process of allowing the Palestinian people to choose their leaders. I hope this will take place. A lot of people are skeptical, but I think this is a realization, even within Hamas, that they need to have support of the people on the ground in order to rule.
Uma última pergunta antes de a gente passar para o Luiz.
And the last question, I have a lot of context with Palestine authorities. Hamas, I don't have that much. And I dialogue a lot, and you got to very profitable dialogues. You see that Hamas has this pragmatic way of thinking. When I talk to my Palestine colleagues, this is very, so far so good, it's clear, but at the end of the day, I'm seen as a colonizer. The Zionist is seen by then borderline in the last level as the movement of colonization. So in last instance, you can have a punctual agreement, not effective, peaceful agreement. You cannot have an agreement with the colonizers. Do you get uncomfortable about that? So you are not in Israel because you are a colonizer, because the Zionist is not a movement of colonization, it's a national movement. It's important, yes or no?
I think it's important to understand how the other side views Israel and the Zionist movement. I think it's also important to recognize the difficulty of declaring oneself as a Zionist today because of what's being done in the name of Zionism, building new settlements, confiscating Palestinian land, demolishing Palestinian homes. This is all being done in the name of Zionism, which puts those people who are liberal Zionist or leftist Zionist in a very difficult position. I relate to myself as an Israeli. I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm a loyal citizen of the state of Israel. I love the state of Israel. And I know that the survival of the state of Israel and the ability of the state of Israel to be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people is only when we end the occupation over the Palestinian people and allow them to establish their self-determination in a country of their own. And when we also say to the 21% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian Arabs that they too are fully Israeli citizens. The state of Israel must be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people and all of its citizens. We can't have a situation where we declare ourselves democratic and the Arab citizens of Israel, who are 21% of the country, have less democracy than the Jewish citizens of Israel. This is not acceptable. So if you want to be a Zionist in the modern world and a liberal and not a colonizer, it's important to understand that we must have equality between all of us within the state of Israel, and we cannot occupy the Palestinian people.
Você ainda acredita em dois estados para dois povos?
You believe in 2 states for 2 people, right?
I do believe that that would be the ideal solution. I hope and pray that we have not missed the opportunity because of the changing realities on the ground.
Ok. Muito obrigado, Baskin. Agora eu vou passar para o Luiz e a gente depois faz as
Thank you, Baskin. Now we are going to have Luis, and you make the connections that are crystal clear. Luis, I am thinking about your books. What I mean by that, you and Baskin are in the radical, deep, atavic of public intellectuals. This is a consolidated position, but people do not understand. Your public intellectual is not only public. It must be intellectual and reflections being created with the challenges in the middle of the way, but it's not only this marble tower of the university. You are the public intellectuals, you and Baskin. So when I see the development of your practice as a public intellectual, since the trope of the elite of the troop at the last levels, books that you published within the first night of fascism in Brazil, I see that there is a radical change, not in the reflection of Brazil, but in the concern about Brazil. Your concern is was really palpable. So when you see on the other side of the street, and other side where you have the community, the slums, the need of connecting the safety, security is not an excluding, but it is being in this urgent, that is the political polarization in Brazil, and is the fascism that you have in Brazil. You have to be careful about saying that. I say that you are very careful because you say that you are talking about fascism and you say, yes, we are in a political perspective and analytical perspectives, you are talking about fascism. Bolsonaro is put in another place, yourself in another place, Luiz Eduardo. You think Brazil in another way. The inclusion is not a big issue, an urgent issue. It was really the survival against fascism that is the first and must. Great to have you here to participate in this table. My admirations by Professor Baskin and everything that he represents, all the effort he makes is in terms of mediations and the construction of peace and democracy. Michelle, because of your acute reading, very accurate, very precise. I don't think that would be daring to say that, or if it's rhetorical to say that, even though I really see the changes that are in the pipeline, of course, and above the coherence, you have your loyalty of what you believe, your values, and how you believe. So truly, I wouldn't have any problem to recognize possible changes of routes, adaptations, no problem about that. But I believe it's not really a change, my change of perspective, but the change of the country, of our reality, I would say. It's not only conjunctural changes, more deeper changes I'm talking about, changes that are being hired, contracted by our past. What country you are talking about? You are talking about an slavery country for 4 centuries with the structural racism, with a brutality, a fierce brutality of the country, and a kind of atavic totalitarianism that you employed. Of course, you had changes, extraordinarily important in Brazil throughout all the centuries, modernizations. You had the development of the capitalism the way it was. You have to take all of these into consideration. But you had deep changes in the last years in a way that today mediation word has a very specific meaning nowadays. When I was working as a secretary of security in Rio de Janeiro, I was trying to work the mediation so the society of the middle layers and the elite could understand the drama faced by the outskirts and slums. What was happening there? It was really a fall, really a gap of the understanding, to be in the put yourself in the shoes of the other is an imaginary or effort. It's a matrix for morality to have an empathy and solidarity about differences and the similarities. So it could be possible. It was possible, even though you had all these contradictions, because you were building democracy. You were being fed by the dream that you could have a consensual basis, a minimal, could overcome this darkness of the past progressively, radicalizing democracy, the participation, putting value on the German, so you could have empathy and the state wouldn't be so brutal by the policies and the police officers. So you could privilege the reduction of inequalities, overcome of the structural racism, prejudice, homophobia, the violence against the woman. So you would have the chauvinist movement going down, and democratically you could build up a nation that you could deserve this name, that you could go to the future in a democratic perspective. So we had the shared dream, one more skeptical, other more confident, but you had the common faith to have a minimal ground of mutual respect. And you were talking about human rights all the time, and beliefs on the persuasive belief in these values. Now, what you are seeing, a process that are putting us aside of the common basis to overcome the contradictions. You are feared by many reasons that have to be analyzed, and the examination is in this first night. And the other book that I wrote, you went to another diverse reality, and the division that you have in the society, besides all these inequalities, social, economically speaking, and this all structural racism and the police brutality motivated by the state. But besides all of that, you have decisions in the principle of a reality. So now you have bubbles, foggy bubbles, having anti-democratic values in it, with the typical arrogance of the authoritarianism that are more vibrant. And you have these attachments that are destructive, and you see the other as an enemy that must be destructed. And you cannot see an adversary that you can dialogue, you can share common differences, and you can dialogue. The other is the devil that must be destroyed, annihilated. And you have no space in this environment. As you have this environment as a predominant environment, so you cannot have a mediations. At the end of the day, you can have a change based on that. Of course, it's not the only reality that you are talking about, because the major population attracted by this fascism discourse is more than that. They have connections with the contradictory values, that you have this violence and the annihilation, destruction of the other, and you have to expect, and for this you have to work out in this reconstruction of a common base of dialogue, defense of life, and the pandemic imposes this perspective to us. So you have to have this democratic reconstruction in the future, but the future cannot repeat the naiveness, these naive eyes that you had in the past, that gave guidelines to us throughout these years after our constitution in Brazil, that is democracy. At the end of the day, you were very naive, by the way. And if I can give him, Michel, my time getting this synthesis, it's good to share a fact. It's a brief fact, but it was very important in my life, that can give more concrete basis to my observations. In 1999, I worked in the public security in Rio de Janeiro. I was a secretary responsible for safe security policies, to have a reform in the police officers, apparatus, preventive policies. It was titanic efforts. And you had the movement in the extending the democratization, that it was accomplished by the letter of constitutions of 1988 later, so you could extend to an area that it was not tackled by the democratization area, that it was the public security in their institutions. So the military officers had the 144 that had the preservation of the police module, the organization structures forged in 1969 during dictatorship. And these police officers had this heritage in the time of slavery, and along the 20th century you had the tradition of brutality against Black people, poor people. Of course, to transfer these institutions to a future to be redefined based on the dictatorship of the past would be a kind of authoritarian enclave in the democratic phase. It was a big challenge, by the way. In 1999, we tried to open this closed box so you could transform the way of having more than formal measures. You had to go even more than that. I went to a very important Islam in Rio de Janeiro, and I was with me the vice governor, Benedita da Silva, by the way, from the labor part of Brazil, and all the group of the chief of police officers. It had never happened before. It was brand new what you did, and it was surprising. It was January, February of a new government, so elections were not the point. There was no electoral purposes in the game. And so, of course, the society, the media got interested. Of course, the local community of the Islam. And you had a meeting where you opened channels. So, Michel and Professor Baskin, that would be interesting to share this experience with you, because it was in that moment the beginning of a mediation effort, of having a dialogue on the table, around the table. And together you could rethink and redefine state practices, commitment, responsibilities involving the local community as possible. And you were there above all to listen to each other and to listen to the community members. You know, you have this popular hospitality, but full of skepticism, full of lack of trust. You had the high police officers, the vice governor. How are you here in the slum to know what's going on? And it took time. So the police, the members of the community to talk, took time. I was trying to have the proper environment. You know that the people are afraid of talking, to bring testimonials, but we did our best. And then the women had the voice. They were the first one to talk. The first one talking about her son assassinated, murdered brutally in front of her house. It was a mistake. Another lady talking about the nephew and about the godson with a lot of emotion. They were talking about barbaric feedbacks that were the impugn, and it was happening ostensibly. You know, could be in the light or in the darkness, and no measure was put in practice. So we had a lot of emotion by that time, and it was very involving. It was such a silence in the places that the cameraman of the TV, they closed the camera in respect to what people were saying. So it was not to be a kind of a spectacle scene. So after a year, listening to these ladies, there was just a man who had the voice, said, I want to talk, stand up, and full of emotion, crying hard. He said that some weeks ago, in the former year, you had events, and he was the one that was there. And you had other tragic events. As when I saw my friends, two friends, being murdered, killed by the police officers in the same way as the others were. I was walking, I didn't know where I should go. I was in the community, it was dark in the night. I went to the room of the Association of Neighbors, and I was full of emotion, crying, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. And I went to this room, I opened the window, and I could see the city. And the sun was coming, the day was rising, and full of emotion and crying hard. I say, how can I talk? How can I tell? How I can give him my point of view to the city? What is going on here? We are neighbors, but we are in completely different planets, worlds, nations. Nothing that happened here changed the routine for the city that is awakening right now. So I was without power. I was powerless. It was so hard as my loss. So in this moment, Professor Baskin, Michelle, colleagues, so I had the missions that you are talking, Michelle and Professor Baskin. If something makes sense in this effort in my life, maybe, who knows, it's not to replace anyone, not substitute for anyone, not to talk on behalf of someone, but to really build this bridge, this channel, so these voices, with these powerful voices, with this truth, testimonials can be listened and they can echo in the city, changing sensibilities and changing the procedures. Because if you change the perceptions of the society in a broad sense, these new perceptions based on the values, you have common values, it will be enough to pressure new governments and old institutions to abdicate, to renounce, to resign this complicity that is criminal with the practice that are in illegal institutions, anti-democratic practices that are reiterations of the worst of our history in Brazil. So these scenes are terrible, are in my mind, are the echoes of these laws, but you are making progress, not because of the networks, but the potencies of the popular leaderships and the young leaderships in the outskirts. These voices are going through, and they are going through the cities with a big, great legitimacies. They have built the bridges that we were trying to build up. If you did something, it's to help a little bit to seed knowledge. But today, in fact, these voices are so legitimate, so powerful that they went through and they imposed the redefinition of the symbolic political traditional geography, center, periphery. So this gap, there is this situation is there. Of course, the hatred, the prejudice are there, and they even got worse. And this is the problem that you have in new bases, Michelle. I would, excellent. Baskin, I have a question. What is the place of the mediator in a society, polarized society? But Luiz Eduardo make the field ready for that. But I had 2 points that I would like to share with you that has to do with Israel. This is what is being Navy, the punctual democratic advancements of distributions of income didn't impede the fascism in a sense to come back. A reference here in Brazil. It is a possible reference in Brazil, maybe. What I'm thinking, Baskin, in a progressive field that you say Israel as the field of peace, weren't they naive in 94, 93 with the agreement of Oslo to think that objective interests, pragmatic interests, punctual interests could make Palestinians and Israelis, I'm talking about the Palestinians that are not sympathetic to agreed negotiation a solution to have also as a reference for them. Don't you think that you are not naive? Don't you think that you didn't see a fundamental issue that what Luis said of a person open the window saying, where they are going to get to know what he was suffering? Do you think that the narrative of the Palestinians and the Israeli shouldn't be in the table of negotiation? Do you think that the feeling when the Palestinian looks at Jerusalem, nobody care about that, and the Israeli the same? Don't you think that you should be on the negotiation table? And the second question, Baskin, if you allow me, the field of peace promoting Israel, an event that is an event that Luis brought, is event that the day of the Israeli memory and the Nakba of the Palestine tragedy, they are in the same day, in the same event. Israel, the day of the memory, talking about the losses that they have since 48, and the Palestinians talking about since 48. Don't you think that it's crucial? Is it possible to build a narrative, a national joint narratives between Israelis and Palestinians? Is being naive, if you think so?
I think you ask a lot of good questions. I think it's very difficult to answer them in the short period of time that we have, but I'll do it telegraphically.
Pegue seu tempo, tá, Vasco?
One of the lessons that we learned in the process of mediating or negotiating, over decades of years of work is the need to create what I called, and it's written in my book, joint stakeholder negotiating or mediators. We've had very bad experience with outside mediators, whether they be from the United States or from Europe or from other places. The most successful Israeli-Palestinian negotiations took place when the Israelis and the Palestinians were by themselves in the room without a third party. There's a power dynamic that takes place, for example, when the Americans come into the room, that the Israelis speak to the Americans and the Palestinians speak to the Americans, and the Israelis and the Palestinians don't speak to each other. That's why we, in our work in IPCRI, in the Institute I founded, created these joint stakeholder mediator teams where we had an Israeli and a Palestinian working together as a team in mediating the meetings between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In the 24 years that I co-directed this joint Israeli-Palestinian center, we had more than 2,000 working groups of Israelis and Palestinians meeting on an ongoing basis, dealing with every subject that we dealt with in the peace process or in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And that's why I assert very strongly that we were not naive, we are not naive, and we won't be naive in the future. The problem with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process is that we had a lot of unexpected events take place. Who could have predicted that the Israeli prime minister would have been assassinated by a Jewish extremist? When Rabin was shot at that night in November 1995, I was at the demonstration, not far from where he was shot. When we heard the shots and we heard that he was shot, everyone assumed that it was a Palestinian who shot at the prime minister, and everyone was shocked that it came from within Israeli society. That was the beginning of the demise of the peace process. The agreements might have been naive in the hope that we would continue to negotiate, build trust, and get along. But when the peace process broke down, it broke down because we had an unexpected change of leadership in Israel, and we had a continued process of breaching the agreements. So rather than building trust, we built a lack of trust in the process. It is true that the most difficult items to deal with are the issues of narrative. The Palestinian narrative and the Jewish Zionist narrative are completely against each other. And as you correctly said, our Independence Day on May 15th is the day that the Palestinians mark the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened to them. In Israel, the day before Independence Day, as you said, we have our Memorial Day. And over the past 13 years, two very important organizations, joint Israeli-Palestinian organizations, one, Combatants for Peace, are former Israeli soldiers and former Palestinian militants who came together and said, we're putting down our weapons and we will resolve our differences through nonviolence. And another organization, the most important organization here, is the Parent Circle, or the Bereaved Parents Forum. These are Israelis and Palestinians whose dearest loved ones from their closest families were killed in this conflict and have come together and said, no more. We don't want any more members of our organization, people who were killed in this conflict. We want it to end. And these two organizations, Combatants for Peace and the Bereaved Families Forum, for the past 13 years, on Israeli Memorial Day, come together and hold a joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial service. On Independence Day, I want to celebrate our independence, and I hope for the day when the Palestinians will celebrate their independence. But when we stand together in moments of silence on Memorial Day, we can all remember those who were killed and who are victims of this conflict. And doing it together is such a powerful message. This year, because of the coronavirus, it was the joint ceremony on Memorial Day was done online. It was done on Facebook and on YouTube, and there were more than 200,000 participants in that evening on Memorial Day. It is the most important day, I believe, in this country, because it's an opportunity for us Israelis and Palestinians to put our separate narratives on the side and to say we are all victims of this conflict, and we have to work together to end this conflict. And it will never end unless we sit down and talk with each other. And that's perhaps the greatest lesson that we have learned over the years, is that boycotts don't work. Not negotiating doesn't work. Not talking to each other doesn't work. It's only when we engage. My great hope is the young generation who can find new ways of interacting and engaging. And perhaps one of the most important developments is the increasing role and recognition that we need a role for women in the negotiation of this conflict. We don't have women at the negotiating table, and this is a great failure in both Israel and in Palestine. We see young Israeli women and young Palestinian women who hopefully in the coming years will rise to positions of power. Let's look at the women around the world, the women governmental leaders who have led their countries in this corona pandemic that have done so much better than most of the men around the world. And I think it's obvious that we need to have women on both sides at the negotiating table and engaging in peacemaking. And I think we'll have a much better chance of succeeding. Just recall back to the 18 years that Israel spent in Lebanon. It was a movement of 4 Israeli mothers who stood up and said, no more, we want to bring the boys home. And they changed Israeli society. 4 Israeli mothers who said, let's pull out of Lebanon. And they did. In 2000, Ehud Barak was prime minister there, giving into Israeli public pressure and understanding that we had no longer any business in Lebanon that pulled us back. So I think there's reason to hope. It's not naive to be hopeful. We need a bit of naivety. All peacemakers are in somewhat naive, but let's face the reality. The overwhelming majority of Israeli security personnel, both present and past, and the Palestinian security personnel are the strongest supporters of the two-state solution. They believe that peace is possible, and they're the ones who bear the responsibility for security. They're the biggest advocates for peace.
Vou pegar aqui o final do que o Baskin falou.
Okay, what Baskin said, Luis, I would like to say and listen your opinion about that, hear from you about the police officers in the state of Rio de Janeiro. I remember Marielle Franco, the municipal deputy, murdered, assassinated actually, that to say that where the black gets to the position, become police officers and kill the black people and kill their black relatives in the end of the day. So you are not naive. You are naive to open the debate, but not when you are in the debate. Do you think that is possible? The idea of women, as you said, Baskin, to get the position, the leadership, but the debate can come together with the people that are the killers. But what Basque brings, the debate, are with the victims and with people that kill. The most important aspect of this debate, this memorial ceremony, that all of us are victims, all of them are victims. And this anti-democratic fascist wave that you are surviving, do you think that it's possible to imagine that, what Basque just said, in our society? Do you think that the police officers can get to an activity like that with the victims of their own violence? And we can have a debate about violence and not only about police officers' violence only? Michelle, I think it's possible and necessary. And it's really is not that much. It's just a little bit of daring. We are very close to the future that you imagine. When you forecast the future, what you live in the past, imagine roots that can be reproduced. But you have corners, you have portals that you can have unexpected breakthrough. We are what you are and describe, not because of the intrinsic potentiality of the life. It is written in our existential experience, but I'm talking about values that are preserved here in Brazil, and this is dislocated, and they remain there, tacit, pulse, vibrating, getting an opportunity to be mobilized again, and to have the ethical culture. Let's put it this way. It is complex and contradictory, and you have this repertoire. Can then get along together, then you can awake potentialities and get into the concrete ground. The women are decisive. What Baskin said is very important, very decisive indeed. You have this experience of the mothers of the Square of May in Argentina. They are paradigms to us. You have an experience in Latin America, in Colombia, in Brazil, as well. More and more association of mothers, victims that were killed by the urban violence and by the police officers. And the big challenge is in promoting approaches, proximities for the ones that are close to each other. They are separated by a membrane, by a wall that is diaphanous, that is permeable more than you think. Here I have this book, Demilitarizing the Mothers. I dedicate this book to the mothers, the kids killed by the police officers, and the mothers that had the police officers killed by the violences. So it's a fratricide war. You know, when the mothers, the victims and the police officers that were killed, when they understand that this is the only pain on the table, this fratricide war is an absurd. If they got together, it would be revolutionary. This is the adjective that I use in this case, because they could conceive the process of a change in a potential scalability. And you have a basis for that. Marielle called this attention because the military police is in one of the institutions that traditionally recruit Black people. And this institution is responsible for these absurd processes, this massacre. in a way that these black police recruited by this machine, institutional machine, they are crushed and inducted to convert to become the destruction instrument for their neighbors, their brothers and sisters. So they are explored in a labor perspective in all these institutions, in the military institutions especially. I have a very courageous persecutor in Rio de Janeiro, had denounced and went there to where the places of the denouncements took places, and they have the military police against their own institutions, and they report that she presented to the government of the state, it was like this: I was in the pacificators police units. This is the name, but at the end of the day, they became violent. It was expected to be so. And I went to these peacemaker units that used to be peacemaker, and I brought these police officers that they were like slaves. They were really like slaves. They were in such containers, with more than 50 degrees in the darkness. The air conditioning didn't work. There was no maintenance at all, no water, no food. They had to ask for food as a favor. The ballot protection out of date, expired. They were frightened all the time, traumatized, no sanitary conditions in place. They had to go to the forest around, to the place around to go to the toilet, if I say. So they had all these critical issues in a daily basis. And some sensitive police officers, they read these document, sensitive people, colonels, that are really linked to human rights. It can happen because they are military officers. So military institutions, they are super explore the labor force. They cannot question the situation in a disciplinary manner. This is not humane at all. So you can understand these soldiers recruited in the outskirts of the city, frequently submitted to this exploration, humiliations, and they are learned as first dogs to kill their brothers, and the mothers have to have the bodies, and they cry for their bodies. The mothers come from the same places. They are sisters of the same pain. And this process that has no sense at all, they are being encompassed by the society as part of the landscape. So these women must organize themselves, but the voices are not being heard. And they didn't have this main brain collapsed, because they are very close to each other, and the mediation is very important to make this proximity come true. So to wrap up, in 2013, when you have the major demonstrations in Brazil, I suggested to have a colonel of the military police of Rio de Janeiro that have the same perception as I do, that you promoted a meetings between the black blocs, militias, if I say like this, and police officers of the shock troop, with all the uniforms, mirror each other, with this reciprocal hatred that went far beyond the politics or professional aspects. So I got to know many guys involved in this black bloc movement. It's radical movement. And I knew the police officers. I heard them. I dialogued with them, the black boys. Black blocks boys. They were very close to each other in terms of the police officers. They were skeptical of the institutions. They had the repulse of the power that was put them down, and they have the same hope that brought them in the same directions, and they can share values and ideas. If they had the opportunity that they can really put off the uniform and they can go side by side with the young people without masks on, they could share the common humankind in a more abstracted way, but also the concrete life experience. And dialogues like that are capable of revealing that is not the peace that is the most difficult thing, it's not the understanding, but to build up this hatred. It was very cost. It took a lot of institutional building blocks for that. It's much simpler to be naked and share the concrete experience lived. If you have this dialogue space and you have to have a demolition of many obstacles, then build up enemies as armies, and they will hate each other in a disciplinary manner. I'm not talking about an abstract hatred or love, but we are talking societies that are repelled. Social structures, they are repelled by the two sides in the intimacy, as I can give my testimonial about that. So there are many rooms, and you have really to be cautious not to reiterate these blocks, these black boxes. So there are possibilities, laws, threads that can have a new tapestry, possibly. So you give me the opportunity when I am looking aside, you are going to a plan of action, a possible debate, a radical, atavic, deep between Brazil and Israel. It is so important to me to have this joint Memorial Day between Palestinians and Israelis. It made a lot of sense to me. So you can share suffering that comes from different places, but the suffering is the same, the pain is the same, the respect to the pain of the other must be a fundamental element to build up bridges of the future. I saw that, what you are talking about, but today in Brazil, I will ask you, asking first about Brazil, okay, Baskin? And Luiz Eduardo talked about that briefly in his book. Today in Brazil, Israel, the Zionism, is in another place else. This government, in the best hypothesis, is the extreme right government. Let's put it this way, because many people, like Luis said, that it's a fascist government, at least with the deep references to fascism. They use our flag of Israel as a model of function. In the perspective of that Brazilian government, anti-democratic demonstrations have to have Israeli flags as a reference of their values: militarization, racism, right radical aspects. So Baskin, this is the question for you, and then Luis Eduardo Soares, is how you can get your reference. What do you think about that? What does it mean for you? And secondly, how you can get the reference you brought, deep solidarity all about, and bring it to the Brazilian society? Do you think that it's possible to transform it into a reality that the Brazil of Israel does not represent the Bolsonarism here in Brazil, Baskin?
I think it's horrific. It's horrible. It's tragic that the Israeli flag has become a symbol that people on the fascist right wing stand behind. I think this is a manifestation of the Trumpism that we've experienced over the last years and was accelerated and enhanced by the US president, who, thank God, is leaving office in just a few days. I think it will take a great deal of time to heal the world from the experiences that we have seen in countries like Brazil and the United States, and that we see in Israel too. I think that Israel, as the country of the Jewish people, perceived itself in the past as what we call in Judaism a light unto the nations. We're supposed to be a shining example of morality. We have a principle in Judaism called tikkun olam, of repairing the world. This is a central value, or should be a central value, in the expression of Judaism in the modern world today. And unfortunately, it is not. It is true that Israel is a leader in high tech, in various technologies, in biotech, in agrotech, in all kinds of areas where Israel can offer so much to the world. But as long as we are deeply involved in a conflict with our neighbors, and in a situation where we don't have full equality within our own country, between Jews and other Jews and between Jews and Arabs, and we don't have peace throughout the region, Israel cannot be a light unto the nations, and we can't be a shining example of morality, because occupation and the manifestations of occupation don't go together with a high moral code and justice. And we need justice in order for us to go beyond the situation where fascists in the world feel that they can identify with the flag of Israel. That is not the flag that I identify with, and I don't want the Israeli flag to be used by those people for those purposes.
Você considera que os valores que essas pessoas...
You consider that the values are anti-Semite values because a negative reference in the end of the day. But on the opposite of the anti-Semitism that you talked about, now you have a new one, that is this against Zionism, and you have all this.
I think it's very dangerous that we equate anti-Israelism or criticism of the Israeli government policies with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is illegitimate at all times, always. Being anti-Israel or being critical of the policies of the government of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and it is legitimate. It is legitimate to wage legitimate criticism against what the government of Israel does. It is legitimate to question the validity of what the government of Israel does vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. That is not anti-Semitism. But if the government of Israel and the world Jewish establishment equates being critical of Israel with anti-Semitism, we will be unable to identify anti-Semitism when it really exists. And anti-Semitism is never legitimate.
Luiz Eduardo, eu queria te...
Luiz Eduardo, I have this question for you. You work with the imaginary Israel, this imaginary Israel of this new right extreme is white, is militarized. This flag is not my flag of Israel. I know, and we know that you have a reference of a new evangelical command that you use the flag of Israel as a reference, evangelical reference, a species of identification. Do you think this is critical? How can you bring a new perspective and deconstruct it? I do not answer this question, but I think it's critical. It's very severe what's going on. It brings to a horizon, a symbolical, theological, ideological horizon that is quite complex, that you need to research deeply. And for sure, Michelle, you are in a big challenge and big trouble. And it brings a bell, something brings a bell, an alarm, an alert. The meeting, this convergence between the beliefs, neo-Pentecostal beliefs, and the New Testament devotion and the understanding of monotheism that is choleric full of belligerent values, that you can have the bad as the devil that is being incarnated, embodied, incorporated. These are not orthodox readings of the Old Testament, but syncretic that culminate with the hermeneutics and the ones that derives from symbolic productions, from different contents. So this is the expansions that you have since the end of the 80s is really hegemonic, is heterogeneous. You cannot define that is a caricature and respecting beliefs that are legitimate and respectful. But there is a political manipulation, a hyper politicization, that you have distinct ingredients become syncretically appropriate. For example, the symbol of Israel in Brazil, at the first sight, of course, I have to have a lot of understanding, analysis, and research from different sources. It seems that it's an allusion of an attempt of recuperation of essential roots that would be corrupted and lost by the transformations of this modernity. I work insistently in this in my book, The First Night, and you have the testimonial of the field of gender, sexuality, and the aesthetics of defining the body as a state of being. So in the Latin senses, we call the era of uncertainty, and it impact the economy, the work, the family, the traditional institutions. And you have this anguish that is converted by the religious and popular manifestations and the rhetorical, ideological, and political manifestations as well. And they are all translated into unsafety, insecurity, because the male, the patriarchal male make of bronze is imploded. The patriarchalism is being questioned. The female movement, the feminism is going ahead, as well as the anti-racism. So the gestalt, the classifications, the traditional institutions are being unbalanced, and it reinforces this lack of security in an individual and subjective manner. And in this base, you have the demand for order, not the order in the strict sense, in the public security, but the ontological order that must be restored. And this anchoring, ontological anchoring that would be restored would be by the destructive revolution, a demolition of what was added. So these traditions would be the root, the basis, the ground that would be regenerated. So it's really to restore, construct this matrix, the man, the woman, the family, this father as a God that is punisher, that would have a law in the world, that have the war, the blood against the demon that are the others. All the others are our evil. And you would have the ontological restoration instead. It would repair these turmoils, these thunders and heavy rains, and you got to the stability in the subjectivity and intersubjective plane. Well, you can have a leader that can incorporate. That is, nowadays, you have this demand of hatred, that is the President Bolsonaro. He can address the needs of this demand of a symbolic plan that is ontological, because you have this radical matrix. And it's this deep level, so you have the divine united by a anti-modernism traditions with the nature. What is the nature of the divine and the human nature? So the essences would emerge, entered by divinity essence altogether, and then you would have the crystallization of this order that is now balanced. So the leadership that works with this unconscious leadership in a deep sense is the one that presents this joint of values that is fascism by many reasons. The religions are dealing with these demands, but not enough. The incorporation by a political leader with these demands and the response to these demand, and it is written in the political institutionality, the symbolic unconscious dialogue. And then you have in some sites, Israel is being simply a manipulation symbol in a syncretism because of the matrix of the radical aspect to be restored. This order was really unbalanced by the modernity and by this emancipatory changes in the individual aspect. This is very, very critical, very serious. It's not in a political perspective, not in a cultural perspective, but in a theological, symbolic perspective. Intersubjective and subjective spheres as well. Trying to destroy the world that created Israel, that is diplomacy, multilateral dialogues. I don't know if you know Gershon Baskin yesterday. I think he was vaccinated by the second time. So you are vaccinated already,
I am vaccinated.
Baskin. The second, so he's free.
Yes.
I envy you, Baskin. Here in Brazil, you had the first person vaccinated by a Black nurse from the outskirts of São Paulo, Mônica Calazans. Baskin would be coming to launch his book here. And you are going to have a virtual launching of his book. But I would like, just to wrap up, to suggest that in some months when we are all Mônica's Calazans vaccinated as Baskin is, you can have Baskin vaccinated, you can have a meeting between Luiz Eduardo and Baskin in some place else, Israel or in Brazil, because you have a possible connections of dialogue, of overcoming these polarizations to build the authority as something legitimate, that today more and more Israel and Brazil have to dialogue. Women, the idea of the woman, the square in Jerusalem and in the peripheries of Brazil, these connections are necessary, must be done. So I would like to invite you guys. So let's continue these conversations in this project of visiting Israel and Brazil, and then the dialogue is not only possible, but it's urgent. Baskin,
Thank you very much.
your final words.
I look forward to coming to Brazil. I look forward to hosting a group of people from Brazil to come here who visit Jerusalem, the holy city, the city which will hopefully one day be the capital of the state of Israel and the state of Palestine, an open city with two sovereignties in it, a place where we learn to celebrate the diversity that exists in our great city rather than fearing it and hating it. If we all believe in the one God, those who believe in God, that God resides in Jerusalem, And this is where we need to make peace.
Thank you very much. תודה רבה. שוכרן. Luiz.
Muito obrigado, foi prazer.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be with you. I accept the invitation. Thank you very much. You have a lot to learn from you guys. And I hope you have the opportunity to carry on our conversations, have a big embrace from me. So you are going to close up. You have another one as 2, right? And I hope that I can be in the next debate, in this next meeting among vaccinated people. Thank you. Bye.